Well, hello YouTube, it's me, Fortmaster, and welcome back to another Lazerpig reaction. So, the T-14 Armada tank sucks. There's going to be a couple of things with this reaction that I'm not really sure how it's going to work out, but we'll have to see. First of all, this minute is a couple of minutes over an hour long, so I have no idea how I'm going to upload it up to YouTube. Whether I'm going to do a thing where where I basically watch it and then chop out the parts to make the full reaction shorter, or if I'm going to split it up into several parts while I'm editing, or just upload it as a giant singular thing. I have no idea. Most likely is for watch time, I'll split it up into maybe like 2 half-hour videos. But I'll have to see when I'm actually editing. You'll see how this turns out when it actually gets uploaded. Second, you may notice that this screen right here looks a little different. That is because I am not actually watching this video on YouTube. I had to download the video and save it onto my own computer. So basically, the internet in my area is being upgraded, like the infrastructure. So they sent out a letter saying that, you know, for this week, expect service interruptions. So of course, the day after Lazerpig uploads this video is the day where they finally get to my section of the neighborhood, and that's when the internet starts turning on and off every half hour. In fact, if I look out my window, I can actually see them with the ladder up on the cable, fixing and replacing things. So yeah, that's why I've downloaded the video so I can actually watch it without it cutting out. So, the T-14 Armada, the Russians' modern super tank. The one with the unmanned turret only has a crew of 3. Well, I mean, all their tanks had a crew of 3 recently. But also has not appeared outside of parades, at all. And this coming off the heels that apparently trains full of T-55s have been spotted moving towards the front. So yeah, I don't think Lazerpig could have chosen a better time to upload this video if he tried. As always, link to the original is in the description. So without further ado, let's actually get to watching this, shall we? World of Warships. Okay. I think World of Tanks would have been more appropriate, but hey, still, it's money's money.
In 2015, the Russian military did something it had never done before. It built something new. Finally, the Russian army would no longer just throw more crap onto the T-72 and claim it was better because they'd made the number bigger. No, This time they'd actually done the impossible. They'd somehow managed to build and design a whole new tank.
Actually, no, that is funny. It's like the Russian military had done the impossible and actually created something new. Just that line alone, that kind of showing everything that's been happening recently in there with Ukraine. Ugh.
And this time it wasn't just a T-80 with an extra road wheel and a bunch of cardboard bits attached to the side. No, sir. This was real. They even had multiple of them and everything. And they moved. This was real. It was actually going to be produced. So rise to your feet, every pony, and charge your glasses. For in 2015, finally, we welcomed Russia into the dawn of the 21st century of combat. No longer would Russia be shackled to its old Soviet image, strapping more and more funny armor boxes onto vehicles half a century old. No, sir, this was a modern vehicle, built to compete with the very latest of modern Western armor, and this was just the beginning. Soon fleets of new vehicles, guns, and warships would propel Russia into the ranks of one, if not the most elite and advanced fighting forces in the world. So you must be asking yourself,
where are they?
What the fuck happened? But first, that time. Yep, we're good. World of Warships, they pay my rent. Anyway, back to the video.
Finally.
When the T-14...
I don't know whether I'm going to keep this the whole ad spot in the video, but quite literally, that ad was almost 5 minutes long.
was unveiled, everyone and their mother in the military community pissed themselves like a frightened horse, and immediately the knuckle-dragging tank experts of the internet started huffing balls.
Hey, Blinkov's Battlegrounds is pretty good.
In an effort to tell us how obsolete this one new tank made everything else that came before it. It's invincible. It's the most powerful tank in the galaxy. All of the NATO nations are wetting themselves over it. Nothing can compare to the T-14 Armata. And then slowly reality set in. T-14 combines all the ultimate in Russian technology previously introduced onto NATO tanks 25 years ago, in a way that only a country trying to inflate the share prices of Raytheon would understand. It does away with all the unnecessary ERA systems of the T-90, which cannot protect the tank against missiles that were invented in the 80s, and instead replaces them with an active protection system that can almost defend the tank against missiles that were invented in the 90s. Finally, it features a fully automated turret, a first-generation touchscreen that the commander has to claw at like a shut-in teenager desperately trying to find porn on the family computer before his mum gets back from shopping, an autoloader
Nothing did happen, what?
famous for jamming that now cannot be accessed and cleared when it does jam, is somehow heavier and slower than the tank it has replaced, and comes combined together in a package so expensive the company that made it immediately went bankrupt, the country that bought it cannot afford it, and it has about as much export potential as English whiskey.
Wait, really? The company that designed it went out of business? Really? I mean, I remember seeing all the videos popping up, talking about it, but, I didn't hear anything about this.
Oh dear. But for a while, every idiot with even the vaguest sense of military interest was banging on about this tank as if Stalin had come back to life and had personally forged the hull from his own ballsack, and that all tanks across every nation in the world had just been rendered obsolete. But honestly, the T-14 is, and remains, about as threatening as a 12-year-old proclaiming his sexual prowess over your various relatives. And thankfully, due to recent events, the whaling morons that once inhabited the internet and propped up that Russia-strong culture that we don't like to talk about, but it did exist, have either slowly changed their mind when Putin finally played his 5D chess and it turned out he'd been playing 5D snakes and ladders the whole time, or descended down into the rabbit hole and gone full Vatnik, which are a group of people I like to file under the category of easily ignored. But hey, if you want to take advice from someone who gets all their information from a news broadcasting service where they literally arrest you for not agreeing with the government, that's up to you. Remember, it's not propaganda if you agree with it, because how could you be wrong? You're intelligent, and you thought about it really, really hard. Not like those other sheep, am I right? So Putin was supposed to have about 1,500 of these T-14s by the end of 2021. He ended up with 24. In fact, he may have even less. Keep in mind, with Russia, this is a country that, during parades, drove their nukes around the block, painted extra numbers on them, and then drove them back to the start of the parade to make them look like they had more.
What? I mean, granted, with everything that we've been seeing over the past year, that makes a lot of sense. But still.
The rule of thumb with Russia is, if you don't see it, they don't have it. We've seen 8 T-14s. They have 8 T-14s. Supposedly, they made their combat debut in Syria, which happens to be the most filmed and documented war in living history, and yet we saw absolutely zero footage of any T-14s in action. Rule of thumb, there were never any in Syria. In fact, in spite of every major news outlet proclaiming that the T-14s are on the way to Ukraine and may already be there, oh, shock, horror, I'd be willing to bet that no T-14 is currently in service outside of the 14th Guards Armored Parade Division, who have recently undergone their latest modern update program by upgrading their old logo to this new one from the 1990s Microsoft clip art collection. Quite frankly, the T-14 is not the tank people think it is. It is not the final word in armored warfare. It is not the most modern battle tank ever created that renders everything that came before it completely obsolete. It's nothing more than a fat old Russian sacred cow. And I want to explain why.
Well, I mean, as he said, it's like, as he said before, granted, if it has the capabilities of only just being able to defeat, weapons from the 90s, that's, still 20 years ago now. The T-95. Well, the T-100. Whoops. Oh, no. Is that
a lot of people, when they think of the T-14, will tell you its design roots begin with the T-95, in that it was the first tank Russia designed after the fall of the Soviet Union. Since it was no longer constrained by Soviet ideology in battle, the Russians could basically build whatever they wanted, and immediately they went about abandoning the philosophy of the T-72 and its ridiculous carousel autoloader, the system which has produced some of Russia's greatest memes, and instead incorporated a more French-style cartridge autoloading system, featuring a rear ammunition compartment complete with blowout panels to protect the crew. Not only would this new autoloading system allow the T-95 to fire considerably faster than the T-90, it would also allow it to fire the more powerful and more modern shells that, to this day, the T-90 still cannot use.
Seems it's all the good ideas. Where did they go?
It would also feature a crewless turret with the crew safely contained in an armoured box, and a 30mm autocannon built to allow the tank to take on lightly armoured vehicles without having to fire the main gun. All in all, the T-95 was shaping up to be a real leap forward for Russia, both in terms of technology and military thinking. And though the tank promised a lot, everything it promised was within reason, and had it been developed, it probably would have posed a real rival to the more modern Western tanks we know and love today. There was just one tiny problem.
They were never built.
It was being built in 90s Russia. For those of you who don't know, 90s Russia had somewhere between 0 and absolutely nothing in their budget, and tank programs are famously very expensive. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, and with it, Russia lost its empire, which up till then had accounted for about half its population and around 60% of its GDP. Its overbloated military budget was largely to blame for its economic collapse, so naturally this was the first thing that had to go, leading to an almost total disarray of its army. But don't worry guys, the Russian bear is not been declawed yet. Russia may be down, but we're not out yet, which is why they charged into the 1994 Chechenian War. A war that went so badly for them, it has been cited as one of the most embarrassing defeats in the history of the Russian army. Well, it was, at any rate. Having suffered a defeat at the
things are slightly being rewritten now.
hands of what was essentially local militia, Russia needed to look like this was just a fluke, and it was well on its way to reforming a new, far more powerful, far more modern army. It needed the world to believe that that great Russian bear was alive and well. So suddenly, without warning, comes the T-95. The tank was shown at the Omnisk Arms Convention in 1997. Now, new tank projects are rare, and when one is announced, it can cause quite a stir in the military enthusiast community. So you can bet your ass everyone was huffing balls over the T-95, especially because this was back in the 90s and really no one was really doing anything. But if you had a time machine and went back in time to see the T-95 in action, prepare to be disappointed. The tank was kept as far away as physically possible from the crowds and observation platforms. It was covered in camouflage netting and did nothing more than drive around for a bit before being taken away. It would only ever be seen once more in a 1999 arms convention in Siberia, where it would drive around this time a little faster and even pause for a photo op, but spent most of its time hidden under a tarp. And there was a specific reason for that. See, the thing is, the T-95 never existed.
Oh my god, I'm gonna see if I can guess here. Is he going to say that what they literally just did was they basically just took an older tank, built a new one on top of it, and then just drove that around?
In 2009, it was revealed by one Colonel Vladimir Voitov, who had apparently been in charge of the project, that the whole thing was never real. The T-95 shown was in actuality a prototype for an elongated T-80 tank that had been built in the 1980s but had never gone anywhere. This would later become recycled into something called the Black Eagle project, an upgrade package for the T-80, which also never went anywhere. The Black Eagle, wow, such an amazing, badass name. You gotta love it. I mean, it sounds like a shit Marvel superhero, but don't you just want to get into its pants? Anyway, the 1997 T-95 had a wooden mock-up turret with nothing inside it, and the 1999 version actually had a working turret installed, but again, there was nothing inside it. No radio, no ammunition, no autoloader, and the gun was just a wooden mock-up. And even in this configuration, the tank proved to be so unstable, its time on the proving ground was cut short. The T-95...
Unstable in what way?
It was nothing short of a propaganda piece, something for the cameras
Literally,
and the
yeah.
Vatniks to swoon over. It was there to prove what Russia was capable of, that it still had teeth and it was not to be underestimated, that it could still run with the big boys. It challenged their Western designs. But all it really proved that was, short of an economic miracle, Russia was going to be relying on that old Soviet stockpile a little while longer. Cut forward to the 2022 Ukraine invasion, and that's exactly what happened. But this video is not about Ukraine. It's about...
Again, I will say once again, the day before this video came out, videos come up of them bringing in trains of T-55s.
The T-14 Armata, because a lot of you might be saying, well, if this tank is so advanced and Russia is so desperate, then why is it not on the front lines? I mean, wouldn't that make sense? I mean, Ukraine's anti-tank policy is largely mine-focused. Yes, they have a lot of man-portable launchers, but these are mostly things like the Javelin, which are the exact munitions the T-14 was designed to beat. So surely, this would be the best weapon for them to have, right? Well, this is where it starts to get just a little bit complicated.
What if the T-14 never existed? Engine. Oh god, I'm getting girls in Panzers
Failure of the
flashes from that.
T-95 to get anywhere outside of a vodka-infused dream meant that Russia had to fall back onto its older Soviet models. Now these models are all, they're all okay, but they all share a singular common feature: the engine. With the exception of the T-64 and some models of the T-80, every Russian tank and BMP has used the same engine, a modification of the Kharkiv Model V2, the same engine used on the Soviet Second World War era BT-7, though it's more famously for being used in the T-34 and KV series of tanks.
Wait, really? Seriously?
And it's the same engine that is being used in the latest models of the T-90, giving it the classic title of the Kalashnikovs of engines, and promoting anyone over the age of 37 to immediately state, well, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, and then act like that's an intelligent thing to say. Like we should be scared of innovation or something. I mean, the Nokia 3310 still works, but you don't have that, do you? You have an iPhone. I mean, why? Did your 3310 broke? Or is it because there's nothing really wrong with just wanting to make things better, and that some of our greatest inventions, which you probably use every day, came about from someone just taking a regular thing and making it better? Or are you going to give up your car and go live with the Amish because there's nothing wrong with the horse and cart? It never broke, so don't fix it. Try thinking before you speak next time. The problem with the V2, while it's still fairly reliable and is an engine that do what engines do, it is, at its core, a design that is 84 years old. The design of diesel engines has dramatically changed and improved since 1937, to the point where the Western domestic market has overtaken the Russian military market. To put that in perspective, the engine of the Honda Jazz generates only slightly less torque than the V12 of the T-90 main battle tank. If you've got a few $1,000s in your back pocket, you can go out to America today and buy a better engine than what is equipped in the most latest and most modern of Russian main battle tanks.
Yeah, that... Wow, okay.
The V2, while it still works, is extremely bulky, extremely heavy, and incredibly archaic in its design. And though it weighs the same as the Abrams ATG 1500 gas turbine engines, with both being slightly over 1 ton in weight, the Abrams can push the 52-ton tank up to 42 miles an hour. The T-90, in spite of being almost 10 tons lighter, can only move at a top speed of 32 miles per hour.
The power-to-weight ratio is not there.
Oh dear. The engine of the T-90 is also extremely loud, much louder than that of the Abrams, which if you've ever stood next to one, you'll know why they call it the Whispering Death. It's also extremely thirsty, not just for fuel, but for oxygen, making it prone to overheating and burning out at high altitude, which became a huge problem for India when it found its T-90s kept breaking down in the mountainous regions between it and China, which meant during many of its border skirmishes with China, a lot of its troops lacked urgent tank support, which led to India restarting its previously cancelled in-house tank comedy program, the Arjun. In short, as a tank, the T-90 should be one of the fastest main battle tanks out there. In reality, it's just as fast as the British Challenger 2, a tank which weighs 20 tons heavier than it. 20 tons heavier. It also features a comedic list of transmission problems, cooling issues, and of course, it famously can't reverse. All of this means if Russia is going to produce a modern tank capable of surpassing...
Wait, what was that thing about it not being able to reverse what?
Western designs, it's going to need a better engine. And this is where the true problems for Russia begin.
I'm gonna guess they
got the mustard.
Suddenly Putin. Of course.
By now, it's the 2000s, it's the new millennium. London's built a big dome, everything's white with black trim, and corners are out. Smooth is the new cool. And what could be more cool than Russia's smooth-headed new president, Vladimir Putin? Putin launches his new presidency with a new war. It's back to Chechnya. This time, Chechnya's annexed, but it would take them 7 years and at a cost of 12,000 of its own soldiers. The war showed that while changes had been made, the Russian army was still a shadow of its former power. In response, Putin announces a series of changes to the Russian military, hailing it as the single greatest military reform in the world. And while the promise of new equipment and better streamlined training bore the focus, in reality, the reforms were largely about reducing the army's size, cutting the number of officers down by 61%, and the number of training schools from 65 to 10. And there's a reason for that. Putin's greatest fear is that a political hero figure will one day rise up through the ranks to challenge him for the presidency, and the place this was most likely to come from was the army. He knew no matter how many knives glinted in the darkness behind him, no one would dare be the first to strike if there was no one powerful enough to replace him, and this included the West. So through these reforms, the army became something young people did to earn merits to secure better jobs and university places. Anyone who remained in the army was typically seen as someone who couldn't advance beyond it, who wasn't capable of doing anything better. For context, think of how society treats a typical McDonald's employee. Officer promotions were handed out based on loyalty rather than ability, stockpiles became shopping markets for scrap metal merchants and arms dealers, and logistics was taken away from the military and reformed into a civilian branch, its ranks filled by mafia members who would turn a blind eye to the theft and sale of equipment.
Again, I'm just going to point at the war currently going on.
If you don't want to know the result of that, look away now. But Putin had made one major mistake. While this kind of system helped reduce the potential of anyone competent in his army rising high enough to challenge him, it meant his military also became a breeding ground for the lazy and the incompetent. And this would be proven in the 2014 invasion of Ukraine. Politically, the 2014 invasion of Ukraine is a masterpiece. It left the Western nations dumbfounded and slow to react, the Western press arguing over who to support, and legions of military nerds giggling at how badass Putin was. The actual ground campaign did not go over smoothly. Ukraine's army.
So if you actually looked at the ground when the 2014 invasion was happening, you could have seen everything that's happening now.
It was tiny, badly trained, highly demotivated, with just a handful of working tanks and almost no logistics to speak of. And though Russia was able to take Crimea, its longer-term objectives to rob Ukraine of its entire coastline, taking Odessa and Mariupol, failed dramatically. Ukraine was able to recapture most of its territory and retake control of the border. And what was worse, its elite troops in the south of Ukraine had been repelled outside of Mariupol by an armed militia known as the Azov Legion. This humiliation is often why you see so much anti-Azov propaganda. Putin was not stupid. He knew his army was largely incapable and had banked on lightning-fast attacks which could overwhelm Ukraine before it could react. He had pinned his hopes on his elite units of the VDV and the 1st Guards Armored, as well as his own personal army, the PMC Wagner Group, believing that their heroic reputation alone would be enough to spare these units the worst of the corruption. But he was wrong. The VDV and Wagner's performance was somewhat lackluster. Ukraine had organized itself a lot faster than expected, and by the time Russian troops were ready to try again, British, American, and French troops were massing on the borders of Estonia. Once again, the Russian army had proved itself incapable. The image of the Great Russian Bear was waning, and though the great propaganda machine rolled without much challenge, so the average Western armchair warlord would believe this was a Russian victory, the experts were watching with concerned expressions. Russia had taken 8,000 losses. Losses it should never have statistically taken. So at the end of 2014, Putin would launch yet another series of great reforms reforms. He would attempt to bolster the power and the reputation of Russia's more elite divisions, reactivating a number of older divisions from Soviet times and placing an emphasis that new equipment and more specialist training was to be reserved for them, believing that the title of guards, as well as the positions of pride and parades, would promote a more professional attitude among its members. And pride of this new reformed Russian army was the new T-14, a family of vehicles based on the new tank chassis, which would include IFVs and support vehicles. But by then, the damage was already done.
How bad can I be? I'm just doing what comes naturally. How bad can I be?
As mentioned earlier, the concept of a new Russian tank would mean having to finally can the V2 engine. Western engines had drastically greater power-to-weight ratios, and if this new tank was going to incorporate all the new systems a tank needed, as well as remain both mobile enough and low-profile enough to suit the demands of Russian war planning, Russia would need an entire new engine to suit this new tank. One that was modern, lightweight, yet powerful enough to drive the tank's final projected weight of 50 tons. There was just one slight problem. Such an engine didn't exist. Now, Ural were the people behind the T-14 Armata project, and in their brilliance that could only possibly come to a bunch of people high on mountain air and vodka, decided just to copy the German SLA-16. You know, the engine from the Second World War Nazi tank, the Porsche Tiger. The famously unreliable. The reason they went
Wait, seriously?
with this engine is because Russia didn't want to rely on Western imports, before building a tank that relied almost entirely on Western imports. What was going on in these people's heads? It might have also been because a considerable number of them had been captured by the advancing Red Army during the Second World War. There had been considerable studies of the engine, and a Russian modified version of it now existed, which was the version of the engine Ural had chosen. The problem was, this version of the engine they wanted, the A85-3, had been built to power oil compressing and pumping stations, not heavy vehicles. The engine had been a complete commercial failure. No one wanted it because, surprise surprise, it was unreliable. But Ural looked upon this unreliable, modified commercial failure of a pumping engine ripped out of a Second World War German tank famed for breaking down constantly, and thought, yes, from this engine we shall build a new Russian tank. And so it began. The T-14 was built around the engine.
No words. No words at all for all of this. I just can't. What? I swear, the people who were just, I mean, granted, I'm fairly certain, like, unlike what he's saying, it was more a choice of desperation than anything else. Like, oh, this old design, old concept with modern, like, materials and modern know-how, we could probably make it work. But still, I mean, there's a certain level of just why that comes up whenever you hear.
This would have been fine, had the engine been any good. Ural, for reasons only known to them, believed they could fix any problems along the way, and accepted huge government contracts to produce the new vehicle. But there was another problem.
Why didn't you fix the engine before you started?
And no, it's not a 60s horror flick. Look, let me give you an example. Congratulations, you've been born in Russia. You're now a proud member of the greatest country in the world, according to them. You've gone through all the mandatory 18-year wait period, gotten into university, and now passed with your groovy new qualification in engineering. So what do you do with your life? I mean, you could stay in Russia and live in a home like this and earn roughly $14,000 a year, or you could move to America, where you could live in a home like this, earn $60,000 to $80,000 a year, rising to $120,000 depending on experience and industry sector. You see where this is going. Brain drain is the expression given to the problem of young, intelligent people choosing to work or study in foreign countries where the pay and quality of life are vastly greater. In Russia, the long-term strategy, where funds were never diverted into making life better for the average worker, means most people outside of a specific few live lives comparable to England in the 1970s. Now, many, most notably people who don't live in Russia, claim it's a culture thing, as luxury is just not a priority to the average Russian. And within Russia, there Yeah, there does exist a certain degree of an almost toxic masculinity culture, where impoverished life and hardship is worshipped as being manly. But Russians are still human. Give a Russian a mansion and he won't turn it into a Slavic slum to prove how much of a man he is. He will just start living a more comfortable life, and if you take it away from him, he will naturally get angry and want it back, as would anyone. The pre-war economic boom of modern-day Russia created fairly wealthy districts within Russian cities, most especially Moscow and St. Petersburg. And when young Russians went there for work or study, they realized very quickly that they quite liked wearing designer clothes, having iPhones, and running water. And they didn't particularly want to return to their hometown, where the likelihood of having an indoor toilet decreases significantly the further from Moscow you are. Nor did they particularly want to live a life where, even with a full-time engineering job, rent in Moscow is on average 90% to your paycheck, or about $900 a month, which means most have to take on flatmates to make ends meet. Or you could move to the West, where you could have all of those things, plus more, plus your own apartment, which you could afford with your significantly higher wage, plus an indoor toilet, plus running water all year. This is why in the mid-2000s, the West experienced a mass Russian migration, especially in countries like Germany. It's also why, when it comes to things like electronic components, heavy machinery, and even pharmaceuticals, Russia is still heavily dependent on Western imports. What that meant is when Euro were designing their new tank, they did not exactly have a huge pool of expertise to rely on, which is why they probably went for an engine which already existed rather than try to develop one of their own, believing that modifying the existing design to suit their needs would be far easier, even if it meant putting a Nazi machine inside a Russian tank, as it paraded through Red Square on the day celebrating Russia's victory over Germany in World War II. It is perhaps for this reason that when the T-14 was first seen during a rehearsal for the Red Square parade through Moscow, it broke down. The sheer centrifugal force of Stalin spinning in his grave caused reality to crack around the tank, because there is no force on Earth that can contain such irony. Or perhaps it was because they famously put an unreliable engine into a 56-ton vehicle and then Pikachu'd faced when it turned out to be unreliable. Let me know in the comments which one you think it is. But for whatever reason, Euro were convinced that they could fix the engine's problems by 2015. They didn't. They then said they could have it done by 2017. They didn't. They then claimed it would be done by 2020. It wasn't. It's now 2023, and 9 years of development time later, those engine problems have still not been fixed. You'd think, of course, the easier solution would be to simply fit the proven V2 engines from the T90s temporarily into the T14s, allowing them to, okay, maybe not operate at maximum efficiency, but at least get them to move without breaking down. The problem is, the V2 engine does not fit into the T14. Neither does any other engine. As I said earlier, the T-14 was built around the engine, specifically that engine. Nothing else fits, and getting anything else to fit would require extensive modifications to the vehicle, which would mean changing the design, which would be very expensive.
This whole thing, it's just, I knew that the situation with the T-14 was bad. Simple for, as he said, it's like it's been 9 years since it was announced and nothing's come up. But I mean, just all of this. I had no idea it was so bad. So, yeah, that is going to be it for this half of the video. I decided I was just going to cut it into 2 half-hour videos just for the sake of watchability. The link to the second half of the reaction will be in the top corner card, as well as in the description. And I might just make the end card literally just the, the other video. So, I hope you guys liked. If you did, leave a like, subscribe, have not, and check out the other half of this. This reaction that just was way too long to begin with. Goodbye for now.